Good evening, everyone. This is Brown at I Have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about the movie Thunderbolt and Lightfoot on Blu-ray. So, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot came out in 1974, and it was the first theatrical film to be directed by Michael Cimino. For those of you who don't know, Michael Cimino was a director who had a rather fascinating career trajectory because he had a legitimately good start, but a rather sudden downfall, one which he never really recovered from. But to this day, film buffs and film historians, regard Cimino's reputation as a controversial one. But starting out, Cimino dabbled in the realm of screenwriting, and he first co-wrote a screenplay with a friend of his that would go on to become the screenplay for the movie Silent Running, which was an environmental science fiction film from the 70s. So if you like movies like, say, Soylent Green or Logan's Run, I would definitely recommend checking out Silent Running. Plus, the fact that it has a rather strong lead performance by actor Bruce Dern, and it's one of my personal favorites performances of his. But yeah, so Silent Running, check it out. But from there, Cimino would then go on to do a rewrite for John Milius's screenplay for the movie Magnum Force. And Magnum Force was, in turn, the first sequel to Dirty Harry, and is regarded by a lot of people as the best of the Dirty Harry sequels. And I'm inclined to agree. But as it happened, actor Clint Eastwood, the gentleman who played Detective Dirty Harry Callahan, actually liked Cimino's work on the rewrite so much that he ended up being the one to offer Cimino his opportunity to direct a feature film for the first time. And this was at a point in time where Clint Eastwood was basically on fire, and he had a lot of pull in Hollywood. And, basically, he was being offered a lot of screenplays to choose from, for his projects. And, if he didn't like it, he didn't have to do it. But if he did like it, he had the opportunity to do it. I mean, basically he could afford to be picky about things at this point in his career. But when he got the screenplay for that Cimino did for Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, he read it and he liked it, and he also, and one of the things he liked about it was the fact that it was a road movie, which was something that he'd been wanting to do for a while now. And so, that, along with his appreciation for Cimino's, skills as, a screenwriter, what with him doing the rewrite for Magnum Force, he went ahead and agreed to star in the movie in the lead role. But he also offered Cimino the opportunity to direct for the first time. So, and Cimino's gone on record to say that, without Clint Eastwood, he wouldn't have had a career as a director. So there you go. But Thunderbolt and Lightfoot was budgeted on somewhere between $2 and $4 million, but ended up grossing $25 million. And not only was it a success financially, but it was also a modest hit critically as well, and it was also a hit with the audiences too. But more importantly, it garnered actor Jeff Bridges his second Academy Award nomination, namely in the realm of Best Supporting Actor. And so, this being Cimino's first time out as a director, having your first film be financially successful and also having, an Academy Award nomination thrown in, that's pretty good. And so, one of the things that a lot of people, mention about this movie is about the behind the scenes stuff is the fact that, while Cimino was directing the movie, actor Clint Eastwood was basically kind of keeping an eye on him, and he was also, making sure that the movie, was on time and on budget, because he'd been around the block as both an actor and a director, and he picked up some tricks of the trade and over the years, and he knew what worked and what didn't work in terms of, say, having a movie, with a good pace, and having something not go over budget. And, a lot of people both say, like on the commentary track in this movie and also in various, articles and interviews, have recounted how Cimino would say, want to do, several takes on something, right? But Clint Eastwood have this rule where it would be no more than 3 takes. You go to take 4, that's too much. And so he would put his foot down and say, okay, no, we don't need a 4th take. We got it. We're good. And, some people on the outside looking in might think that, oh, Clint Eastwood's being a tyrant. But then you look at the movie and how it came out, and it's got a very good pace. And, I mean, you've got that slice of life feel. You got this, male bonding, feel, and then you have a road movie, and then you have a crime drama, and you have it all mixed together, but it all flows so well. And so, Clint Eastwood knew what he was talking about. And as a result, Cimino basically delivered a film that, it worked, but he had Clint Eastwood to keep him in line. And so going forward, Cimino would go on to direct the movie The Deer Hunter, which was a 1978 film that dealt with the Vietnam War and its effects on a group of friends, namely played by Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and John Savage, and also co-starred, and also Meryl Streep as well. But The Deer Hunter was nominated for 9 Academy Awards, and it ended up winning 5 of them, 2 of which were Best Picture and Best Director. And so this being Cimino's second film, The Deer Hunter, it basically, established Cimino as a cinematic auteur overnight. And The Deer Hunter has rightfully gone to be regarded as a cinematic masterpiece over time. And, I personally think it's one of the best movies ever made, and it's one of my personal favorites. And so you would think that Cimino's third movie would be similarly successful, or at the very least, a good movie. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. His third movie was a 1980 film called Heaven's Gate, and it was a sort of deconstructionist Western movie, and it was initially budgeted somewhere between $2 and $4 million. I think it was more like 4 and 5, between 4 and 5 million. I stand corrected, somewhere between $4 and $5 million. But due to various excesses, partially due to the fact that very few of the producers wanted to straight up say no to Cimino when things were starting to get out of control. The movie's budget ended up ballooning from $4 or $5 million to $50 million. And so when the movie hit the theaters, it only made somewhere between $2 and $4 million. And so with a movie costing $50 million to make, but you only make somewhere between $2 and $4 million, that's not good. That's a huge bomb, especially with 1980. And so not only was Cimino's career ruined overnight because of this, so were several other people's careers damaged. United Artists, the production company that put out Heaven's Gate, they went bankrupt shortly after that. And actor Chris Christopherson, who played the lead role in the movie, he would go on to act in other movies, but he never really got to enjoy the lead roles that he did prior to Heaven's Gate. But after Heaven's Gate, he wasn't really cast as a leading man, in a whole lot, anymore because of that. So yeah, it had all sorts of bad side effects for multiple parties. But for Cimino, he did direct some other movies. And at least one of those movies I would say was actually pretty good. That would be the crime drama Year of the Dragon, which came out in 1985, and it starred Mickey Rourke and John Lone, and it had a screenplay by Oliver Stone. And Year of the Dragon I would definitely recommend checking out because, even though it was at a point in time where, Cimino's, career was in tatters, because of Heaven's Gate, I mean, it's actually a good movie, and a lot of people have reevaluated over the years and say that, hey, it's a straight up good crime drama. So Year of the Dragon, I would highly recommend checking out. But unfortunately, though, aside from Year of the Dragon, none of his other films were anything worth talking about, from what I understand. So to be fair, I haven't seen the other three films they did, but just from what I've heard, they're not really anything special, if any, or anything good really. But yeah, so it all started with Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, though. So a lot of people, they talked about how The Deer Hunter is one of those movies that, I mean, it's a slow burn movie. Um, and it did go over budget, but everything just happened to fall into the right place, and everything aligned perfectly to where you had, a once in a lifetime masterpiece. And it's one of those things that, the success of which, you're probably not going to get again, or at the very least, Cimino was, highly unlikely to be able to get again. I mean, let's say Heaven's Gate had actually been good, right? Um, but it could have been good, I'm sure, but it wouldn't have been great like, say, The Deer Hunter was. I mean, that was literally like lightning in a bottle. So, but a lot of people, make the arguments that, you know, the lessons that Cimino supposedly learned with Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, as in, doing no more than 3 takes and, not going over budget, he should have applied to Deer Hunter, because had that been the case, then, it's possible that Heaven's Gate wouldn't have been the financial fiasco that it was, and Cimino would have enjoyed a more better regarded career as a result. But unfortunately, the lessons that he learned here, he didn't really stick to. So, but okay, so now you've got some background on the director and, the importance and, I guess, in the importance of this place in cinema history, I guess you could say, especially with, Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges. I mean, let's go ahead and get into the story. So the movie starts off with the character of Thunderbolt, as played by Clint Eastwood, being pursued by members of his old bank robbing gang, because they're convinced that he stole the money from their last heist and hid it somewhere. And sure enough, he did hide it somewhere, but he didn't screw him over. I mean, that's just them getting paranoid about things, because one of the old gang members had actually had a plan set up, to where they would hide the money, but they would wait a certain amount of time for a certain amount of time to pass before going to where the money was hidden to get it and go. And unfortunately, though, the ringleader of the gang had died of a heart attack, and he and Thunderbolt were the only ones who knew where the money was. And so at that point, the rest of the gang started to get paranoid and became convinced that Thunderbolt had screwed him over. And so, Thunderbolt basically kind of went into hiding, to get away from the gang. And he's been hiding out as a preacher for, some time. But unfortunately, the gang, the surviving members of the gang have caught up to him. And it's at this point where he's being chased by, one of them who's trying to shoot him with a machine gun. And as it happens, their paths cross with a young car thief named Lightfoot, as played by Jeff Bridges. And Lightfoot, driving a stolen car, inadvertently saves Thunderbolt's life by running over the guy who's trying to kill him. And Thunderbolt ends up rather unintentionally hitching a ride with Lightfoot, because he ended up jumping on the car and, forcing his way in. And Lightfoot was kind of like, what the hell's going on, But the two of them end up, striking up an unlikely friendship. I mean, there's kind of a generational gap, but um, they end up becoming friends. And I mean, you have, Thunderbolt, who's got this, sort of grizzled, cynical, personality, albeit not without a sense of humor. And then you have, Lightfoot, who is, somewhere in his 20s and, full of life and vigor and, has got a joke for everything, right? But the two of them end up becoming friends, and Thunderbolt ends up letting Lightfoot in on everything that's happened and why those guys were trying to kill him. And it turns out to see that the reason he's called Thunderbolt is because in the gang's last bank robbery, they had used an anti-aircraft cannon to blow out the wall of the bank vault so they could get to the safe. And and because of that, that's where the name Thunderbolt came from. Uh, but they, but they, but when Thunderbolt, tells Lightfoot, where the money was, it was at this old, wooden church house, and and they decide to, see if they can, not only find the church, but see if the money's still there. But when they get to the location where the church is supposed to be, there's now an elementary school there. So the church is long gone. And so, the two of them are kind of dejected. I mean, Thunderbolt more so than Lightfoot, um, but they get back in their car only to find that the two other members of Thunderbolt's gang, um, let's see, sorry, give me a sec. Red Leary, as played by George Kennedy, and Eddie Goody, as played by Geoffrey Lewis. Um, Red and Eddie have stowed away in their car and take them hostage and force them to drive to a secluded location so they can have some sit down time with Thunderbolt. And Red and Thunderbolt get into a fist fight with one another, and Thunderbolt ends up beating Red, and Red's telling Eddie to kill the two of them, to kill Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. But Eddie's like, I don't want to kill him, and plus the fact that he accidentally gets knocked out by Red. And so basically they sort of declare a reluctant truce, and and Thunderbolts explain to Red what happened, and he's trying to tell him, is like, hey, I didn't screw you guys over, you just got paranoid. And also he was explaining about how the church where the money was hidden is no longer there, and so the likelihood of them actually being able to get that money again is slim to none. But then Lightfoot actually has a crazy idea. He's like, hey guys, why don't we just rob the same bank, the same way, like y'all did all those years ago? And so they're like, you know what? That might actually work, because the authorities, they're not gonna, see that coming. They're not gonna think that, hey, the same gang's gonna rob the same bank the exact same way, And so they're like, let's do it. And so the four of them, they travel to where that bank was, to the town where that bank was, and they put together this plan where the four of them decide, they each get jobs, so that way they can earn some money and in turn use that money to buy the parts that they need to assemble the anti-aircraft cannon. And so with that plan, with that in place, they then they have to kind of improvise with some of the electronic stuff, because unfortunately, their electronics expert was the guy who was trying to kill Thunderbolt, at the beginning of the movie, who was in turn run over by Lightfoot. So, and of course, the ringleader had died of a heart attack. So the four of them are having to sort of improvise and adjust because, they're having to take on, different roles along with the roles that they originally had. But, you know, but Lightfoot, though, uh, he ends up in the awkward position of having to dress in drag in order to distract this rather lecherous bank guard. So that way, he can knock out the guard and disable some of the security. But but yeah, things just sort of spiral out of control from there. but um, but yeah, this was a fascinating film. I'm not going to say like it's a masterpiece, but it's definitely a good movie though. But it's like it's a road movie. It's a buddy movie. It's a comedy and it's a crime drama too. It's like all rolled together, and it's also a rather fascinating character study too because there were uh, critics that even at the time that this movie came out, some people picked up on elements of homoeroticism in the movie. And when I was younger and I saw this movie for the first time, I mean, I didn't really pick up on it that much, but then, when I watched the movie again, I'm older and I'm kind of like, like, yeah, there is quite an there's definitely a strong element of homoeroticism there. And you listen to the movie's commentary track. The people who are on the commentary track, they're film historians, Lem Dobbs, Julie Kurgo, and Nick Redman. The three of them, they talk about the making of the movie, of course, but they really go into the elements of homoeroticism, and it's like you watch the movie and you can kind of pick up on it, and then you listen to the commentary track and you're like, holy yeah, all these scenes kind of like hit in a different way, but but it's like with the characters of Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, it's like there's this sort of pseudo father and son bond that they have, or big brother and younger brother bond that they have. But at the same time, though, the way certain scenes are shot, there is kind of like this unspoken, almost like attraction between the two of them. I mean, nothing happens between the two of them or anything like that, but like there are certain instances where it's like, for example, there's a scene where Lightfoot, I mean, Jeff Bridges' character, I mean, he ends up, picking up two hookers for he and Thunderbolt to have some fun with, right? But we don't see what happens with Lightfoot and the girl he's with, but we see when Thunderbolt is with the hooker that Lightfoot got for him. um, we see them and everything, and the lady, I mean, she looks beautiful and everything, but when we see Thunderbolt's kind of reaction to say their the aftermath of their coupling, he seems more tuckered out and frustrated more than anything. Um, and that could be just because, he hadn't been with a woman for a while, because, I mean, he's been more or less in hiding, for, some time. And so he's just, not used to being with a woman again. I mean, that could be it right there. But then again, after she leaves, Lightfoot comes back and, Thunderbolt's asking him, well, how'd you make out? And he just sort of grins and says, red-haired women are bad luck because the woman he was with was a redhead. So the implication being, well, I mean, yeah, I went off with her, but we didn't do anything. And he has this sort of, look in his eye, and that's sort of mischievous, but little moments like that, like the two of them are more interested in each other than two beautiful women. But also, you have the characters of Red and Eddie, and they almost come across as a cantankerous married couple at times. The way they argue, like Eddie's the more as played by Geoffrey Lewis, is the more level-headed of the two of them, and he's sort of kind of a doofus, but he's a likable doofus. Like he's definitely less bloodthirsty than Red is, um, but whereas Red, though, is played by George Kennedy, he's more, gun ho. I'm going to beat you up if you look at me wrong. I'm going to kill you if you breathe on me wrong, what have you. And so it's like when they're squabbling, it really does come across like this, rowdy, married couple. So it's like you have these two, groups of people. You have these two groups of people. You have Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, and then you have, Red and Eddie. Um, and at times, it's like you definitely see the element of homoeroticism there. Not like, say, in a bow chicka bow bow sense, but just in the sense that they're definitely more interested in each other than, say, you know, some beautiful women that happen to be around them. And I did find it fascinating how, like, there were certain scenes where the camera is definitely focusing on attractive women. Like, there was a point where Thunderbolt and Lightfoot are in a diner, and Lightfoot's flirting with the waitress, and he's taking a look at her as she's walking away, and the camera is clearly focusing on her hindquarters, so to speak. So, and you can definitely tell that Thunderbolt and Lightfoot are both checking her out. So you have scenes like that, but then when it comes to, say, the actual interpersonal stuff, there's definitely more of a focus on, like, say, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, bonding with each other, and then, Red and Eddie arguing with each other. And it's like they all have good chemistry with one another. So even, like, say, without the erotic subtext, I mean, it's a fascinating character study because, with Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, you have this generational gap, but you have the unlikely friendship too. And they have really good chemistry with one another because you have Clint Eastwood, playing the, sort of World War mentor type. And I mean, definitely still a tough guy type, but he's not like, say, the badass that he is in, say, like Dirty Harry or Outlaw Josie Wales, but he's still like, the tough guy. But then, and you have Lightfoot, who, is, I guess you could say, the quote unquote kid of the group who's looking for a father figure, and he's just wanting to fit in, and he's cracking a joke a minute. And Jeff Bridges is just great in the part. And I mean, he definitely earned the Academy Award nomination for sure. And Cimino, actually gave Jeff Bridges, a special set of instructions, like, namely, your job is to make Clint Eastwood laugh. And there are a couple of points in the movie where you can actually, tell that Clint Eastwood's laughing and it's unscripted. And that's when, Jeff Bridges, as Lightfoot, is saying or doing something crazy, And so the humor and camaraderie is really genuine there. And as far as, say, George Kennedy as Red and Geoffrey Lewis as Eddie, they have good chemistry too. I mean, it's like on one hand, I mean, yeah, you have the whole, them arguing like a, married couple, but you also have the whole idea that, yes, these two have been working together for some time. It's like they know how they think, they know how they both click and what have you. And so, so it's interesting seeing things from that dynamic as well. And that kind of made me think of, say, movies like Heat or something like that, or The Sting, where you have, these characters who, are part of a heist crew, and it's like they've worked together so many times that, they, know each other's, skill sets, and, they're able to sort of, move like clockwork in a heist or something like that. So it's fascinating, seeing, their interactions in that regard. And also, like seeing how, like two hardened criminals, I mean, more so for the character of Red than Eddie, but seeing two, professional criminals, who are still, lusting for revenge, after several years. I mean, trying to simmer down and, blend in with, say, like the neighborhood of, and when they're trying to like, you know, take odd jobs so that way they can, you know, get the money for the, you know, aircraft cannon. I mean, it's rather funny, you know, seeing them just trying to act like they're, you know, just ordinary people when they're really hardened criminals, you know. So you have a lot of funny moments in that regard. But especially with Jeffrey Lewis's character Eddie getting a job as an ice cream truck driver, and so and you have Red, um, like at one point he's, you know, he insists on riding along with Eddie in this small ice cream truck, and like the two, they end up getting lost in the neighborhood and, you know, having to turn around and what have you. Um, and George Kennedy, you know, as Red, he actually ends up telling this little kid to go F a duck. So it's pretty funny, you know, um, but yeah, like when it comes to like the actual heist, though, there is an element of suspense and danger because, like, it goes from, say, you know, a road movie, you know, what with, you know, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. I mean, just, you know, traveling the countryside in a stolen car or two, and getting to know each other. I mean, you have Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges having, you know, some really good chemistry with each other. And you go and even just like scenes of them just, you know, stopping for a beer somewhere. I mean, you have some, you know, good, you know, scenic photography, and you also have, you know, just some good character development. So you go from stuff like that, and then you have, you know, the moments of danger when Red and Eddie are trying to kill them, and then it goes into, say, you know, quiet character study, and then, you know, it goes into comedy again. But then when it gets to the heist, you know, once it gets to where, okay, you know, we're goofing around, you know, with these civilian jobs and what have you, but once they get the money and then they get the aircraft, you know, cannon assembled, that's when things get real. And so, I mean, yes, you do have the rather hilarious bit with Jeff Bridges, a young Jeff Bridges, mind you, dressing in drag to distract this, you know, bank guard. Um, yeah, you do have the funny. I mean, that is a funny moment to be sure. But then it cuts to, say, like, say, you know, Thunderbolt and Red, you know, wearing, you know, these, you know, hose, you know, like pantyhose over their heads, like, you know, for masks, right? And, you know, they bust into the home of, you know, this like some sort of a security monitor, you know, for the bank or something like that. But they basically hold this family hostage, and it's actually a spooky scene, you know, seeing it from the family's perspective. And, you know, the way Clint Eastwood and George Kennedy play it, like they're very, you know, fierce and in your face with a gun and what have you. And we know that Thunderbolt's not a bad dude. I mean, he's a criminal, but he's not a bad dude. But he really gets into character. But Red, though, is basically a ticking time bomb. So if Thunderbolt hadn't been there, there's a good chance, you know, Red would just, you know, popped them, you know, right then and there. So there's definitely an element of, you know, threat and danger in you know, the bank robbing scenes, or the heist scene, so to speak. And also, you know, once they get the, you know, aircraft cannon in place, you know, to blow out the walls of the vault, I mean, it's cool, you know, for sure, because this is like a real aircraft cannon, but it's also suspenseful because, like, okay, this is an aircraft cannon. It's going to make some noise. I mean, there is no way the police are not going to hear this, and they're having to be precise about it and everything. So there's definitely some suspense there. And then, sure enough, I mean, well, let's just say that things, they go right, but then they go wrong. And it goes from being like a, you know, sort of heist comedy to, oh crap, you know, everything's going wrong. This is not funny anymore, you know, that kind of thing. I'm laughing just because of how out of control it gets, you know. But and so by the end of the movie, there is a small body count, unfortunately. You know, like, and I say unfortunately in the sense that, you know, these characters we've gotten to know. I mean, whether we like them or not, I mean, we've gotten to know them. I mean, they've endeared themselves with us enough to where, you know, we're invested in them, like as a group, you know. And so when things happen to where not all of them make it, you know, out of the picture alive, I mean, uh, there it's let's just say it's a very bittersweet ending. I'll just leave it at that. But yeah, no, I mean, this was a good movie. I mean, it's it's multiple, you know, genres kind of thrown together, you know, but I mean, it works so well. And you know, it's got a good pace, and I mean, Clint Eastwood keeping an eye on things behind the scenes probably had a lot to do with that. And the cinematography is, you know, rather nice to look at too, especially with the countryside. And the film, you know, it was shot by a guy named Frank Stanley, and it was in Montana's Big Sky Country, and the music was by D. Barton, who worked with Clint Eastwood quite a bit, and so you have like a cinematographer and a composer, you know, who worked with Clint Eastwood on more than one occasion, you know, working with Clint Eastwood again in this movie. So so even if you don't know that these guys have worked with Clint Eastwood before, I mean, you watch the movie and you listen to the music, and there's not a whole lot of music in the movie, but you know, when there is some music, like it feels familiar, and the way the film's shot, it feels familiar too. It looks familiar because of how it's done, and there is a grainy look to the film. And some people might complain about that, and because they're thinking because it's Blu-ray, it's supposed to be pristine, right? But I actually like the grainy look, you know, because it really puts you in the mindset that this is a road movie from the '70s. And so, like when you see Thunderbolt and Lightfoot on the road together, you know, whether they're hitchhiking or driving a stolen car, I mean, you really, you know, get, you know, invested in the movie, like in the sense that you're just on the road to nowhere with these guys, you know, just like they are, you know. So um so yeah, I mean, you know, it's a movie that, you know, it not only looks good, but it actually is good too. So um and also, you know, I do appreciate how, you know, I wasn't around in the '70s or anything like that, but I know that like there were a lot of movies that, you know, sort of, you know, tapped into this whole desire to just, you know, go on a trip to nowhere. I mean, you might have some loose idea of what you want to do or where you're going, but you know, in between all that, who knows? And so it's like an aimless journey. And in a way, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot does feel like that. Like there's an objective, but getting to that objective initially, it's just like this aimless, you know, road trip, you know, up until say Red and Eddie, you know, cross paths with Thunderbolt and Lightfoot again. But I like that feeling though, because I mean, there have been times where like I'll be like, okay, I've got a day to myself and I want to do something, but I've already done this, that, or the other. I'll just go drive around. You know, it's that kind of feeling, you know. Um, and so when the movie's like that, it's very relatable, I think. But so yeah, I mean, the movie works in a lot of ways. I think that as far as say, you know, what I, I would say kind of kept it from being like a great movie. Um, I don't know. It's hard for me to describe. I think just because like maybe just because of, you know, how the movie was made or how it's you know, how it's put together. I mean, it does feel aimless at times. And I know, like, I just got through saying that, you know, the going on an aimless road trip, you know, feeling is a good thing. It's also kind of, you know, one of the downsides of the movie because, you know, when they're not, say, when they haven't crossed paths with, say, you know, Red and Eddie, you know, when they're not on the bank heist, there's like a lot of padding, you know, like they, you know, stop over at a lot of places, interact with some, you know, random people. And it's not like bad, you know, per se, but at the same time, it does feel like, you know, things are slowing down. And a little bit of, a few scenes where they slow down, I think, work out rather well. But others, I feel like, okay, they might have been able to cut this, that, or the other, scene. And because, the movie, for the most part, goes at a good pace, but when it slows down, it does kind of get to where it's like you're aware of what's going on screen, but at the same time, you're kind of like, well, wait a minute. I mean, what kind of movie are we in now? Um, because for the most part, it manages to combine genres rather well. But when we're so invested in, say, one or two of the genres, but then, it goes into, say, slice of life mode all of a sudden. I mean, I don't know if I'm making any sense, but there are moments where the mixing of genres does, cause the movie to slow down in a way to where it's kind of like you're wanting things to pick back up again, And so when they get to the heist, that's when things really do pick up again. But I mean, it's not altogether a bad thing, though. But I guess maybe just because, you know, in some respects, there's a certain amount of pacing that I'm usually used to. And, when I watched Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, like, for the most part, the pacing was good. But then when it got to the parts where it was slowing down, that's where I was kind of like, well, I mean, check watch, that kind of thing. But thankfully, that wasn't throughout the whole movie or anything like that, But for the most part, the movie remains like a fascinating character study, as well as a relatively successful mixing of genres. I mean, the parts where things slow down put aside. But, and I will say that, I mean, it wasn't necessarily a problem for me, but the element of homoeroticism, might put some people off. And I could see where it would, because like I said earlier, when I watched a movie when I was younger, um, I didn't really pick up on it. But then when I watched it when I was older, I was kind of like, yeah, I see what they're talking about. And then, you listen to a commentary track, and they're pointing out specific parts of certain scenes, and you're kind of like, oh wow, yeah, it's definitely there. So I'm not saying like that's a problem necessarily, but if you say, remember watching Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, from one perspective, you might find yourself thrown for a loop when you end up watching it in through a different perspective. Say if you either look up some of the information about the movie, or like on some of the subtext stuff, or if you listen to a commentary track. So that might throw some people off. I mean, it didn't necessarily throw me off, but it was just something to be, aware of, I guess. But, and also, and this might have something to do with, it being made in the 70s, but, some of the, like profanity and stuff is a lot more loose than some people would probably be used to. I mean, we're not talking like, say, Scarface or Quentin Tarantino loose, but more like when there's profanity being used, it's rather, brutal and in your face. And usually that comes from, say, the character of Red, as played by George Kennedy. And for the record, I was going to say, George Kennedy does a really good job in this movie, because you see him in a movie like Cool Hand Luke, and then you see him in this, and it's like, I mean, he's a hardened criminal in both movies, but, in this movie, he's just straight up mean, okay? And he does a really good job of selling that, type of character. And Geoffrey Lewis, though, as Eddie, I mean, he plays this sort of lovable doofus, and you kind of feel sorry for him because he's put upon by Red, but and also it's like he's probably the most mellow guy of the group, next to Lightfoot, but it was cool seeing Geoffrey Lewis, working with Clint Eastwood and these other guys, when they were all at this point in their careers. So, I mean, there's not really a whole lot to complain about with the movie. I guess maybe just because of when the movie was made, it might clash with, the way, other people are more used to seeing, how movies are made today, or, more recent, I guess. But um, I'm going to go ahead and give Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good movie. As far as bonus features, you have an isolated score track, which is basically, the instrumental parts of the movie, by itself. I haven't listened to that yet, but it is there. But you also have an audio commentary with the film historians Lem Dobbs, Julie Kurgo, and Nick Redman. Now, I mentioned that earlier, but we're talking about extra bonus features. There we go. And you have the original theatrical trailer as well. But the commentary track, though, was something that was a fascinating listen, and oftentimes a funny listen too, or a humorous listen, I should say. But it's informative in a lot of ways, and a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, in terms of finding out how the movie came to be made and what have you, and like what what it was like to make the movie, for some of the actors, and from some of the stuff that the historians remember reading about, from interviews and what have you. But when they bring up the elements of homoeroticism, that's when things get really interesting, because whether you agree with things being depicted that way in the movie or not, like whether you, let me phrase that, whether you're more along the lines of Thunderbolt and Lightfoot having a sort of father son, or older brother or younger brother bond, or you're on the camp of, on the side of them having like an unspoken attraction with one another. When you listen to a commentary track, and when the film historians like talk about that, they make some good points and for their case. And so at the very least, you go away being able to, say, appreciate the movie from a different perspective, I guess. And so, I mean, it's definitely a fascinating listen. So if you like commentary tracks, it's definitely worth checking out for this particular Blu-ray. But yeah, that was Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. 4 out of 5 stars. Thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. And you got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So y'all take care. Have a good night. Bye.